Every once in a while, I like to take a look back at the X-Men franchise. With the benefit of hindsight, I think it's interesting to view the highs and lows of the series and see what other people think of them. Personally, Days of Future Past has always been my favorite, but I understand why people tend to pick Logan as the best, even if I personally have some issues with it. Yet when I see lists ranking the films from best to worst, or if I talk amongst people I know who have seen all of them, more often than not I see Dark Phoenix ranked as one of the worst. Today I want to give the film the defense that it never really seemed to get. While it does have many flaws, I think there are many things that the film does right, and overall, I do believe it's a worthy entry in the franchise that does not deserve the incessant hate that it has gotten since its release. I think it's important to take into account the absolutely horrible hand this film was dealt. For one, this film was helmed by a first-time director. Now, Simon Kinberg had written a few of the X-Men movies before this, but this was the first movie he was ever actually directing. This movie also had some extensive reshoots which ended up changing how the film concluded and was also being released well after the Disney-Fox merger. It's safe to say this movie didn't have a whole lot going for it. Now, with all that in mind, I think it is a miracle that this film is as steady as it is. Comparing this to something like Suicide Squad or Justice League, both of which were films that were plagued with reshoots and changes during production, Dark Phoenix is a far more consistent and coherent film. The tone is clear throughout and it never feels like you're watching a movie that's been heavily tampered with. The only part of the movie that does feel kind of different might be the climax. That whole sequence does feel like a more experienced director helmed that section. The earlier action sequences in the movie feel a bit more amateur, but that sequence is incredible, but we'll get back to that later. One thing I absolutely love about this movie is just how it looks. The colors have this unique aesthetic that I have a hard time even describing. The scenery is a bit desaturated, but then the actual colors that are on screen really pop out, like the characters' costumes, the lightning that Storm blasts, or that Phoenix energy thing that comes into play, all look beautiful. Compared to how plain Apocalypse looked, I greatly appreciate the unique aesthetic that this film has. There's lots of good uses of shadows and reds that give this film a really unique aesthetic, especially compared to the other entries in the series. One of the most common complaints I hear about this movie is that Jessica Chastain's character is a weak antagonist. This is something I do agree with, honestly. Her character doesn't have much of a motivation, or much of a character really, and while Jessica Chastain does do the best with what she has, by the time the movie ends, I think most people watching will most likely forget the fact that she was even in the movie. With all that being said, I don't think this film has a weak antagonist. I actually think that the antagonist in the movie might be the best aspect of it. Of all of the choices that this film made, I think the best one it did was choosing to make the villain of the story the character who had effectively been our protagonist for the last 3 entries in this series. Charles being the villain was something that no one really could have predicted. Much like how Spider-Man 3 effectively took Peter Parker and made him the antagonist of that film, here we see Charles absolutely destroy the family that he spent so long trying to protect. His inflated ego and inability to properly handle Jean and her powers leads to the majority of the conflict that occurs within the movie. He doesn't listen to Hank, therefore Hank ends up leaving and teams up with Eric. His dismissal and failure to help Jean ends up leading to Raven's death, and his inability to properly help Jean is what causes her to leave and distrust him. Before this film, none of the X-Men movies had really done anything like this. Taking Charles and showing us a version of him who is selfish and short-sighted was something so refreshing and unique to this film alone. Sure, we'd seen him at a low point in Days of Future Past, but in that we didn't see him actively hurting those around him. I think part of the reason this works so well in this film is the fact that not only are we seeing this for the first time, but so is Jean. We spent 3 previous movies with this version of Charles, and up until this point, he was a consistent ray of light, positivity, and hope for all the characters, so getting to have the status quo broken not only shifts our preconceived notion of who Charles is, but it shifts Jean's as well. Jean feeling so betrayed and hurt is something that we as the audience are able to connect with and understand since we're also experiencing this for the first time, and I think Sophie Turner is able to communicate that really well with her performance. The man we see at the beginning of this film is far from the man we saw at the end of Apocalypse. Some might see this as a case of character assassination, but I kind of find that hard to agree with. This film was set nearly a decade after Apocalypse, and humans change as time goes on. Whether it be for better or worse, it's pretty rare for someone to stay the exact same for their entire life, especially when it comes to a character like Charles, who in this story is at the front of the world's political, social, and cultural landscape. Him being this almost political figure who's in charge of keeping good relations with normal citizens and mutants would obviously have an effect on you one way or another, and I think this film handles Charles' character pretty well. One small thing I want to mention is just how good Hans Zimmer's score is. I can't play it due to copyright, but I'd recommend going and listening to it. It's one of my favorite scores he's ever composed, and his music greatly complements many of the dramatic and intense moments here. Now, while I'm singing this film's praises, I'm not saying it's perfect by any means. There's some awkward line delivery at certain moments.
If you touch her, I will fucking kill you.
Jennifer Lawrence's makeup looks pretty different from the other installments, and here it looks a lot worse. It's kind of funny how all 3 of the X-Men movies that had Quicksilver in them had to find a way to write him out of the story in one way or another simply because his powers would solve any problem the team would come across. And lastly, the movie's short runtime is both a blessing and a curse. It definitely doesn't waste any time, but once we reach the climax, it does feel like had we spent more time with these characters building up to the 3rd act, it would feel a bit more satisfying. The implication seems to be that this is supposed to be the epic culmination of events that this film has been building up towards, but we don't spend quite enough time with these characters to make it feel as conclusive as the film seems to think that it is. A character like Nightcrawler seems really out of place since he has nothing to do in the movie. It's nice to see Hank and Charles mend their fences and to see Jean forgive Charles, but then a character like Storm will pop back up on screen and it feels so weird and unnecessary since she's been relegated to effectively being an extra for the whole movie. That being said, when it does come to the climax, I don't think any action set piece in this franchise can even compete with it. The train fight in this movie is such a strong and well choreographed fight, and I don't think it gets nearly enough praise for how good it is. There's so many things that make this fight work as well as it does. For one, before this set piece, there's very little action in the movie. Any of the action before this is kept small scale and very brief. Once we actually get to this train fight, it feels so grand in comparison to what we've seen before this. Even if this train fight is small scale in comparison to other climaxes we've seen in other superhero movies, for the purpose of this film, it feels large and impactful. Second, this climax gives every character their own moment to shine. Nightcrawler gets to go absolutely insane, and we get to see him use his powers in fun ways. Magneto gets this awesome shot with all these guns being pulled off the wall. Beast gets a couple of cool moments as well. The smaller scale of this fight also makes it to where there's always a clear sense of where everyone is and what's going on. In so many other blockbusters, there reaches a point where there's so much going on screen that it becomes mind-numbing to watch. Here, that never really becomes a problem due to how much more restrained this fight is. Lastly, the fight doesn't go on for too long. The movie knows just when it needs to end, and it leaves you wanting more instead of just begging for it to be over. I know this movie has a largely negative reputation, but if you haven't seen this movie in a while, I encourage you to give it a second chance. And if you never saw it, maybe give it a shot. It's a shame this franchise ended the way that it did. While I do like this movie, it doesn't feel like a proper conclusion the way that Logan or Days of Future Past do. With that being said, I still think this movie managed to be at least a decent entry for the franchise to go out on, and I hope that in the future this movie's reputation becomes a bit more positive than it is currently.